as well. It's not an
All
argument
right.
for. Yeah.
Welcome to our open faith discussion this week on Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure. I'm Steve Hunt and joined by our panelists as we discussed free will and determinism last week, and the proponents of determinism laid out their views and we asked them questions. And so this week, we're going to let those who are more inclined towards free will describe their arguments, and then those who are in the panel can ask questions. I'll start with kind of my main thought or personal argument, as I am one. I believe that we have an element, at least, of free will. Last week, we talked about it as more of influenced will, that of course, we all believe that we are highly influenced by all kinds of external influences. And that I think that in each of our decisions, maybe not even each, but in at least some of our decisions in life, we have something inside us that allows us to make a choice to affect what's going on. And while I can't prove that, and I will try to lay out some of my own arguments, as will others here in this video, I want to say that something I hold to is this Pascal's wager type argument, where even if we don't have any kind of free will or influenced will or choice, that we still need to live as if we do. Because I personally believe that if we have no choice and we can only act as dictated by God or by the forces and particles of nature, if all of the external influences cause us to make every single choice in our life, then that seems to me to mean that we have no responsibility or accountability for our choices. We couldn't have done otherwise. So, and I feel that if we don't have, or we believe we don't have accountability and responsibility, that we will make poorer choices based on that idea. And so back to this Pascal's wager idea, either the universe is determined and all of our decisions are predetermined or determined entirely by external influences, or it's not, and we have some kind of internal choice. And then in a quadrant diagram, either we believe that we have some kind of free will or we don't. And as I have said to all of you earlier, that means that if we believe we have some kind of free will and we're right, then we will take responsibility and hopefully make better choices. If we believe we have some kind of free will and we're wrong, we have no free will, well, we couldn't have believed otherwise, and it really just doesn't make a difference that, what we believe. If we do not believe we have free will and we're right, well, that doesn't make any difference either. I mean, we couldn't have believed any different, and so on. But if we do not believe we have free will, and Dave has drawn the diagram for us, so I'll switch to his view here. Dave, go ahead and show that again. If we believe that we do, say that again. We're not hearing you for some reason.
I said I think my writing might be showing backwards. No?
No. It just shows backwards to you. It's good to us, but it's still blurry though, unfortunately. So, but if we do not believe we have free will, if we believe that all of our decisions are determined and we therefore have no responsibility for them, but we are wrong, and in fact we do, we are likely to make poorer decisions. And so of the 4 quadrants, there's only one that has negative consequences, and that is the state where we think we have no choice. We think all our decisions are determined for us by external influences, and then we are in fact wrong, that we did have a choice and we should have taken more responsibility and accountability. And that's the only of the quadrant of the 4 that would be inappropriate. And so whether we have free will or influenced will and the ability to choose or not, I feel that we must live as if we do. And so I invite Daniel, I suppose, to comment. How do you live your life with the belief that you have no free will and that all your choices are determined? And how does that affect your decision making? And what do you think about this Pascal's wager as I've presented it here?
Yeah, well, I will agree with you to some degree. I think there is danger in believing there's a possible danger in believing that your choices are determined. You don't actually have any choice in what you do. You can kind of become fatalistic, like I'm sitting on the couch watching TV and part of me thinks I should work out, but I don't have free will and I'm probably not going to end up working out anyway, so I'm not going to do it. and that kind of becomes one of the factors that causes you not to work out. So, that kind of thing can happen. I think that's a mistake, to become fatalistic just because you believe in determinism. So for myself,
But isn't becoming fatalistic determined?
The way I look at it is this: we don't know. Even in a deterministic system, we lack the ability to consider all the factors and run all the calculations in our brain to know what we are determined to do. So epistemically, what we're going to do is closed to us. We don't know in advance what we're going to do. So we all have that illusion of free will, whether we believe in free will or not. So in a deterministic system, I don't deny the feeling that I have free will, and I don't deny living as if I have free will. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I don't think that I could do otherwise. I don't think that I could choose to live as if I don't have free will. I still live as if I have free will, even if I don't believe in it. So I don't know. The only thing I could say that I really think differently about as a determinist is the role of punishment. So less vindictive, more about correcting bad behavior, more restorative, as opposed to punishing somebody because they deserve it. That's probably the biggest way that I've changed as a determinist.
Well, and that's interesting because I tend to feel similarly as far as punishment is concerned. I don't feel that vindictive punishment serves as well as, restorative and helpful and all the things that you just mentioned anyway. And so you can have those feelings about punishment, whether you're a determinist or not. And
for sure.
now, Joey, based on your view that things may be determined, but they're determined by God, and your view that there are second causes and that we still retain some accountability and responsibility, that I guess conflicts with the Pascal's wager that I was presenting. What would you add to this Pascal's wager idea of why we need to at least assume that we have some kind of choice?
Yeah, I'm not sure where compatibilism fits on your wager, because I believe both. I believe things are determined by God's sovereignty, and we are also free. And so I don't know where to put that on your Pascal's wager. But one comment I wanted to make was, we've stated a few times that like everybody just lives as though we have free will. And I've even said it, I think I said it in the last video, that I live as though I have free will. But the thought struck me, and actually it struck me before we even recorded our last video. So this is something that I've been thinking about, and just it didn't come up in our last video. I don't know that everyone does live as though they have free will. I wonder if me and Daniel living our lives that way is a product of our upbringing. I think there are probably some, and the problem that we have with this panel is that we're all white dudes, living in the Western United States, right? There's got to be other cultures somewhere that do believe in a kind of fatalism, that do live their lives as though everything is determined, and that has implications for the way that they do everything, day to day. I have no idea what that looks like because I wasn't raised in that culture. But I will say that there are times when I think that I have lived my life or made a choice or a decision based on my new worldview. And it's very cliche. I think it's
like?
more popular.
Is
well, it's more popular in like Pentecostal
I don't really
circles and
think
stuff,
I should do this. Yeah. How do you know that I'm actually not choosing my free will choice? I'm actually going with something that's determined.
The cliche is and I think Joe even mentioned this in one of our previous videos, the idea of, or maybe it was just in our back channel, the idea of letting go and letting God, like I think I trust God more to order things so that certain outcomes will happen. Whereas I don't know, like someone who believes in libertarian free will would take more responsibility, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and be like, well, God is just going to let this play out however it plays out because everybody who involved has got free will. So if this is going to go the right way for me, I'm going to have to help it along,
it's interesting though that you say let go and let God and trust God, because to me, that seems to be something you can only do if you have the will to do that, or that it only matters if you have the will to do that. Because if God is determining everything, then it doesn't matter if I let go, let God and trust God. it's all going to be God's way anyway. But if I have the choice, and this to me is the only thing I actually do have the choice. This is my opinion on it, that the only thing I actually do have the choice to do is to let go and let God, to lean to God and just say, God, I want your will, versus to lean away. And so it's interesting that you say, I have chosen to let go and let God because I believe he's in control of everything. But I would think that to be a reason why it doesn't matter that you let go and let God. He's in control anyway.
Right.
What?
I
No
don't.
thoughts on that. No thoughts. All right.
No thoughts on that. No.
Well, maybe I want to hop in, illustrate this with an example. Let's talk about petitionary prayer just for a second. If God is going to do what he's going to do regardless, does petitionary prayer make sense? For me, praying for someone else, does pray for someone's health, right? Someone's sick, we're going to pray for them. Does that even make sense if God has already determined that the person is going to die?
I mean, arguments I've heard for that basically from the opposing side is that, like, in God's grand scheme of things, if he wanted this person to be healed, or that was part of the plan, then he helped you predetermine so that you would pray, so that that's somehow backwardsly, a cause of this person being healed. But still, it's like you didn't choose to pray. Is that some form of God praying for the thing that he wanted, that he didn't have to have happen in the first place to have you pray for, to have you learn something? No, you weren't going to learn something because it's all up to God. Anyway, same question, I guess, but I think those are the answers that I've traditionally heard. Is there another angle?
Joey, that's you.
Yeah, probably
Yeah,
do. Sorry.
I confess I only heard the last half of that question. I was researching a quote that popped into my head when Steve had his question. So, I mean, I would say that my worldview is very God-centric. I think a lot of the things that God does, he does for himself. You can think of it as the Father doing things for the Son and the Son doing things for the Father. So I think that, and in a sense, a lot of redemptive history is the audience is the host of heaven, the angels. I think that God is putting his glory on display. And so, this goes back all the way to the Continental Divide, right? I see in conversations a lot of conversations I've had with Steve, I see your worldview as being very man-centric. It's about me actualizing my own potential. It's about me achieving my own exaltation, right? And I see myself as a pawn in a much larger game. And that is very humbling, right? It is very, well, geez, do I really want to even play this part then if I'm just a pawn? But then on the other hand, there's something about that is like, it frees me. It's not about me, right? And so, yeah, I don't, the example you gave just now of like God doing things so that I learn a lesson. I don't know that I put a lot of stock in that kind of an idea, but I don't know if I answered your question because I didn't hear the first half of it. Like I said.
Did you have a quote then that you found or that you wanted to share?
It was a quote that I thought of it's a thing Michael Horton said once. Michael Horton is a theologian. He's on staff at a seminary somewhere. I don't know off the top of my head where he's on staff, but he says, people ask me, why pray if God is sovereign? And I respond, why pray if he isn't? And so the whole idea of, you were just saying that, like, why would I even let go and let God if that's all just determined, but like, if God isn't in control of everything, then you can't let go and let God either, because he's not even in control of anything. So it's kind of I think it sounded to you kind of circular or something, but I don't know.
But don't you feel that's possibly a false dichotomy of you have to be all powerful or you have no power? I guess that's how you're going to ask, Jacob, because I think in the Mormon view and
that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've been debating a lot of people on Facebook about this issue this week. For some reason, it just came up, and there are other Latter-day Saints, which is funny because a lot of Latter-day Saints do believe in, God knowing the future, and I try to point out to them that that's not consistent with at least actual libertarian free will, where the agent, us, is the one choosing between. But they have kind of the same view of like, well, God's outside of time, and he it's not God that's causing, or it's not his knowing that's causing the thing to happen, but it's the thing happening that's causing God to know it. And I have to point out, and maybe I'll point that out here, but in the end, the fact is that, if you replace the fact that God knew it in time doesn't really make a difference if he knew it outside of time, because the fact is it's fated either way and we couldn't do otherwise. And I think I'll have to find it at some point, but William James, even Boethius, even though they came to different conclusions, they at least recognized that that's not even what the argument of foreknowledge versus free will is even contending. It's not contending that God's foreknowledge caused something. It's that if God foreknows something, it has to be the case. Therefore, there's no other possible way about it. Therefore, there's no other alternative. And if there's no alternative, there's no freedom. And I know we talked about that a bit last week, but.
And that's precisely, you get at the crux of the problem I have with other systems within evangelicalism: Arminianism, Molinism. These are $5 words you guys can look up on your own time, I guess. Go read the Wikipedia page about Molinism and Arminianism. But these are systems where they believe in ex nihilo creation, they believe in the creator-creature distinction, but then they try to smuggle a true libertarian free will somehow in the back door, and it just doesn't work. So one of the questions, if we're putting the free will proponents in the room, if we're putting you guys in the hot seat this week, kind of like how we did with me last week, we didn't really put Daniel in the hot seat for very long last week, and I regret that. I'd like to at some point put him in the hot seat for a little bit longer, but if we're putting you guys in the hot seat, that was one of the questions I wanted to raise was, does God have exhaustive foreknowledge of events? Does he have any foreknowledge at all? And if so, how does he have that? And how is that compatible with libertarian free will? And Corey, you started to say a little bit. So would you call yourself an open theist or a process theologian, or
kind of a mix between the two? Like I personally, and this is what I've been arguing with people about, so good, I've been reading up on it, but I think for the most part, like there's a lot of things that I disagree with my father's conclusions on, but I think this one I'm pretty in the same camp of, is that what does he call it? I don't remember. I think it's eventually called God's contingent knowledge, but God can know all things that are knowable. And that's what the open theist position is. It's that the problem there is you have to adopt what's called the A theory of time, because there's A theory of time, B theory of time. B theory of time says everything, the past, present, and future are factually, like I can't remember exactly how you term it, but they have truth value to them in that they exist and they exist now. Whereas the A theory of time or presentism as it's called, says only the now exists. And so you can have knowledge of the past being God, perfect knowledge if you live through it, but the future doesn't yet exist to know. Therefore, knowing the future is the same, or not knowing the future is the same as God not knowing the number of scales on a mermaid. Irrelevant because it's illogical because it doesn't exist yet. But what God does know, at least on this view, is all possibilities. So anything that could possibly happen, and all probabilities of those possibilities at any given moment. And what that means, of course, it's not just like me, like, oh, well, that means anything, I can't know anything. But I think, at least for myself, if you've ever read Isaac Asimov's The Foundation series, they come up, it's a science fiction book about this guy that has a mathematical equation, basically, that he can almost determine. He says, we have an empire, it's this intergalactic empire, and it's going to fail in 300 years. I've done the math, and if you do the math on all the deterministic things that everyone's going to do, if we continue at our present course, we will fail as an empire in 300 years. And so he goes along and he intervenes at specific times in history to try to keep it on course. And that does, but eventually an anomaly is introduced that he couldn't plan for. It was like some mutation, and that anomaly throws the whole thing off. And I think they try to get it back on course, but the point is that if there's any sort of free will within that, God can't perfectly predict the future, but he can be very certain about what's likely going to happen at this time. But that probability changes as we go forward, because I'm sure you've heard of the butterfly effect. A small thing has large impact later. So, but knowing all possibilities and all probabilities does make God all-knowing, but we have to redefine what the all is that he's knowing. So that was a long answer to get at that.
Yeah. Something that my wife and I have talked about before is, I guess if I can kind of interject here and kind of share my thoughts or where I'm coming from. I'll do something and my wife will say, we have this thing, oh, I knew you were going to do that, right? She knows me so well that she knows the choices I'm going to make. I'm still free to make that choice though. And it's just that, and part of it is maybe that idea that maybe we're kind of like creatures of habit, right? We're going to do the same things over again. I'm going to go to this restaurant. I'm going to order this meal. It's not that I have to, but I'm more likely to do so. And I guess my take or my approach as far as free will and how I view that in God's orchestration, I'll try to illustrate it with something that's known to me, and that's theater. Specifically, what I love in theater is directing. I love directing a show. And there's a lot of aspects and pieces and parts that go together to create the end result. And my job as the artistic director is to oversee all of those pieces coming together. And I ultimately have a vision of what this play is going to look like and how the set's going to be and how everything's going to work. But I designate and delegate those responsibilities to certain people who then craft and create those parts, and then we put it all together. And so the end result is never exactly the way that I envision or see it, but it's always the way that it needs to be or that it should be, if that makes sense. I can coach the actors. We can go over lines. I can say, well, here's the motives. This is the reason why the character is this. Here's what was going on beforehand in the scene, and kind of coach them and guide them. But ultimately, the way that they read the line, the way that they deliver it, it's up to them. And I'm not going to micromanage and say, no, you must take 3 steps to this location and you're going to turn 3 quarters and you're going to say it in an exasperated tone and make sure that you have an upward inflection on this. I could do that, but that takes away from the beauty of theater, of the beauty of being an agent, an actor, right? Being an agent is to act. And, we kind of toss around our coined the phrase, influence will. Well, in the church, what they talk about is agency, which is different than maybe normal Christendom where they say free will, right? And the term or the idea of agency is that we are free to act, to take action or to not take action on things. And so I don't know if my thoughts have been clear as I've shared.
So how do we have faith in something that is not certain? I'm following up on Joey's question. To those of us who believe that God doesn't know everything that we're going to do and he's not in control of everything in the universe, are we justified in having faith in him, in God, that things will work out, and letting go and letting God if some random choice or action by one of our fellow agents might in fact throw him off?
Right. Well, that's
I want to hop in on this one.
Go for it.
Yeah, and this might be what you were going to say. I think an analogy that illustrates this really well is the analogy of God being a master chess player playing against a complete novice, right? The master chess player doesn't know.
I would take it one step further, because I've been thinking about that too, about chess as an analogy, but also a master chess player, I would say, playing against an ant. Not just a novice chess player, but essentially playing games with ants who can go random directions and do whatever they want, we suppose, maybe, but that there's just no comparison. But keep going, Jacob. Keep going with you.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not saying that like he's playing against us. All right, this would be God versus everything that's happening. And just like a master chess player, no matter what happens on the other side, he knows, and it's of course master chess player on the next level where he knows exactly all possibilities and what the right counter would be for each possibility. So no matter what's happening on the other side of the board, this master perfect chess player is always going to be able to come out winning. How the pieces move around and how that happens isn't necessarily already determined, but there is a pathway designated towards victory for his purpose always.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that, because that is what I was going to say, the master chess player analogy, is that it is that we can have, at least how I understand it, the fact that we can have faith solidly in the end, it is God will be victorious because he has the power to do that. In fact, if he has any foreknowledge, it's of his confidence to be able to accomplish that task in the end. And so we can say, yes, I can know the end from the beginning is a famous term, but that at least in this view means I know I know the actions that I will take. That works with prophecy. If you do X, I will do Y. If you don't do X, God will do Y. And I don't think every prophecy can fit into that category perfectly, but I also don't believe all of the biblical authors had a unified, philosophical worldview, and so that obviously can lead to other ones. But most of them do fit into that. It's prophecy saying, I will accomplish something, and then God goes ahead and accomplishes that. But also there's many instances in the Bible of God being surprised or thinking about something or changing his mind even about from what his plan was. And though, again, the same caveats exist for those type of things, there's at least room in the Bible and the scriptures for this kind of view where the future is open. And if the future is open, and one last thing I want to say is that I think, at least in my view, and you can tell me otherwise, but Christianity, the crux of Christianity lies in the idea that a person can change from their current state and their natural thing that they've fallen into and do otherwise. They can repent. They can say, I forsake these sins. Not saying that maybe there's factors in that. Maybe they're brought up, they see things happening. Maybe it is even the Spirit of God working within them, but it's not valuable in God's eyes, in my view at least, unless then with those influences, with a creative synthesis, if you will, of all of the factors in their life, that they then make that choice. And that's what's morally praiseworthy. Without the agent itself, there can't be a moral decision that's praiseworthy by God or anybody.
All right, so Dave, jump in. I'm inviting you for the first time.
I've been pretty quiet, mostly because I'm so burned out on this topic. The listening audience, if there is anybody listening out there, hello, does not realize that we have been debating this, going the rounds in a text thread, and it's just exhausted. We've just exhausted it. And so I think, at least from my perspective, I just have nothing more to say. But I did kind of write down some of my overview thoughts so that I could say, okay, look, this is the kind of thing that I've been saying. This is my position statement. So I want to share that. But first of all, I want to say, I really appreciate what Corey's been saying. It's like you got a camera in my brain and you're saying it better than I would say it. I think that I do accept as a very strict definitional matter, I accept that there are limitations on God's power and on his knowledge and his foreknowledge and things like that. I think those things are necessary concessions that I have to make in my theology, and I'm comfortable with them because I think that he has all of the power and all of the knowledge that he needs to save those of his children who choose him. And yes, I said choose on purpose because that gets to my whole position statement. So skipping the part that I had here about free actually means without influence, and as a practical matter, we're talking about influenced will. There's still a difference between influenced will and determinism, in that with influenced will, the agent still has the power to weight the factors that are at play in that subconscious decision, and ultimately to select actions after all the influence votes are cast, so to speak. So the question is, well, with what are these agents selecting actions, if not a balancing of myriad subconscious influences? Well, with something non-influence. We can call that the X factor, or we can use a word that we've all been using, will. It's a good as word as any other word, so we'll just use it. So the question is, how can we prove that that will exists? It can't. Like Stephen said, it can't be proved, just like determinism can't be proved. As far as I'm concerned, neither of these propositions is provable. So because they're not provable, should we continue to debate whether they're a true reflection of reality? It doesn't really make any sense to continue to debate that once we've established that it's not provable. Rather, we should talk about them in terms of persuasion rather than proof. So in my view, determinists have what we've talked about on the back channel as the burden of persuasion here, because free will has met its initial burden through perception alone. We perceive that our decisions are not determined, therefore the burden then shifts to the determinists to prove that they are. Perception always
Not to
meets the
prove,
initial
but to-
burden. What's
to
that?
persuade. As you just said to prove the
Oh,
burden
did I
shifts
say
to them to
proof?
prove.
Yes, the
Yeah,
burden
no, to
of
persuade that
persuasion.
they are. Yeah.
Perception always meets the initial burden of persuasion, and those arguing that perception is incorrect have the burden of proving or providing evidence. Sorry, not proving, providing
Persuading
evidence that perception is wrong. But in any case, I'm convinced that neither side can prove the proposition. So, the question, sorry, I'm skipping in my statement here, is whether we should evaluate on some other metric such as usefulness, which is what you did, Stephen. With your Pascal's wager. However, even that assumes its own conclusion because pragmatism as a decision-making framework assumes will, right? I think that, if you're asking us to do what is most pragmatic or what is most useful, we have to choose pragmatism as a decision-making framework. But at any rate, that just takes us in circles. So my best argument for free will or influenced will or non-determinism is the thought experiment of tying our decisions to some mechanism of indeterminacy. And I know that Daniel disagrees with this. That's okay. This is how I make sense of it. The most accessible example is making decisions based on a coin toss. If I get to a fork in the road and I decide I'll flip a coin and I go left on heads, right on tails, I've tied my own decision, which a determinist would say is inescapable by my subconscious being overwhelmed by the contests of billions of considerations, yielding some kind of plurality decision. I have tied that decision to what I'll call a mechanism of indeterminacy. In other words, I can veto all of the many complex influences at work simply by choosing to do so. And I believe if I'm able to give that veto power to a coin flip, then that implies I have the veto power to give. Having a veto over all of the inputs influencing my decision-making power is, I believe, de facto free will. But you'll respond, a coin flip is not truly a mechanism of indeterminacy because the coin is following physical laws. If we could crunch all the numbers, the speed of the flip, the tension in the thumb, the weight of the coin, the air friction, we could even predict which way the coin would land. And that's undoubtedly true. But the coin flip's just an accessible example. There may be other mechanisms of indeterminacy in quantum physics or other realms we don't understand yet. If there is any indeterminacy in the universe, we could just as easily tie my decision to that indeterminacy, such as, for example, whether a proton goes left or right in an atom splitting, which, as I understand it, as far as science knows now, is apparently indeterminate. To tie my decision to the proton thwarts the decision-making in a determinate sense and is therefore evidence of the ability to make decisions outside of determinism, which is decisions made purely based on determinate influences. If outside of determinism, then I believe with the X factor of will, because we're left with influences plus some unknown. We might as well call that will. But even if quantum physics is not truly indeterminate, that's not the point. I believe that the ability to tie my decision to any arbitrary mechanism, whether indeterminate or not, is the ability to thwart deterministic decision-making, which relies on an unbroken chain of causes and effects. So we don't need, and this is important, and I promise I'm almost done, we don't need the actual mechanism of indeterminacy. We only need the thought experiment. If I could tie my decision to a mechanism of indeterminacy if one existed, and if one existed, I absolutely believe I could, then I believe that's functionally the same as actually doing it, because why? We're exploring human agency here. And the only difference between the thought experiment and an actual test run is the state of technology. And my essence or agency does not change with technology. So if I can do the thought experiment, it doesn't really matter if I could identify or actually tie it to a mechanism of indeterminacy. So again, finally, to summarize, if in theory I could give veto power to a mechanism of indeterminacy, then I believe that implies that I do have in reality a veto power to give. And if I have it, then I can use it myself without the need for the atom splitter or the coin flip. The coin flip is just a magic feather. So that's the statement that I wrote.
Yeah.
And I'll take
If
questions.
I can comment on how I understand that really quickly, because from our back channel discussions, what I feel happens when you say, if I can tie my veto, my choice to something indeterminate, well, then I have a veto. And that you say that, and then the answer comes back from the determinist. Yeah, but we don't know that thing is not determined. And so really you're just following a deterministic path. And so it's essentially that the determinists are requiring something truly indeterminate, truly random to exist in the universe in order for them to concede your argument. But then as soon as you've said, let's just assume something truly random, and I'm hooking it up to that, then they insist that, okay, even if we assume this thing is random, you have to then, the next argument comes that you have to prove that you are in control of that random thing in order to prove that you have agency, that somehow the goalposts seem to move. That a second ago it was, well, give me something truly random. And when we say, let's just grant there's something truly random, then they say, well, show me how you control that truly random thing so that you have agency. And that's not what you were trying to prove in the first place. You're not trying to show that you control the random thing. You're just trying to show that you can take your decision and by yourself, like you said, veto it, give it to something else. It's not the randomness in the universe that you're trying to prove, and it's not the randomness that gives you free will. It's the decision to give away your decision.
Right. If I can break the deterministic chain of causes and effects in my own decision making by tying it to a truly random mechanism or a mechanism of indeterminacy, then I have proved that I am not bound to follow that deterministic decision-making process. And if not determinism, then what? Influences plus X, right? Determinism is influences equals decision. If I break deterministic decision-making, then it's influences plus X, which is, even if I'm not controlling the where the proton goes, it implies, because I can break the deterministic decision, it is a dichotomy. Because I can break the deterministic decision-making chain, that I am making a decision based on decision influences plus X, and I can call that will. Again, my way of saying this, and I know Daniel is losing his mind right now, but my way of saying this is, if I have a veto to give, then I have a veto. I don't have to give it. If I can give my veto power to a proton splitter, whatever it's called, an atom splitter or a coin flip or whatever else, then I have the veto power without the atom splitter. So if there's no such thing truly as indeterminacy in the universe, in the physical universe, that still doesn't mean we don't have agency in a metaphysical sense. It just means we're back to the impasse at proving it either way. I will note one other thing that we haven't talked about. As a believing Latter-day Saint, because I am one, our scriptures, and this is kind of Joey's epistemic analog, do repeatedly affirm that as children of God and possessing some of the same essential elements of eternal intelligence or divine spark that is his own essence, we are agents free to act and not to be acted upon. That's the source of our moral accountability. This is central to our gospel. And so, this is one of those things that in our early conversations that I think, if you don't believe that you have the ability to choose, I don't know if you really could claim to be a believing Latter-day Saint. I think this is central. Maybe you could, and if somebody watches this and says, no, that's exactly me. I am a Latter-day Saint. I do believe, but I think we're determined. I would want to talk to them about whether we're talking past each other on something, because I do believe that 99.999 repeating % of our decisions probably are pretty much, given to us subconsciously based on
like
those
Joe
influences.
said, his wife can predict what he's going to do. I think that,
Sure.
that we do. I think God knows even more about us. And yeah, 99.999%, like you said.
But
then
the question of the question is not in practicality how many of our decisions are made outside of a deterministic framework. The question is whether we can make decisions outside of a deterministic framework. I think that the mechanism of indeterminacy thought experiment says we can, and therefore that's as far as I need to go on that. But Daniel's been waiting patiently to rebut. So go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah,
He doesn't say it, I will.
I was going to say you're assuming that you do have the ability. You're begging the question. You're assuming in that framework that you have the ability to choose to flip a coin. To
Does he
and
not? He can't.
what I'm
No,
saying
no,
is
no, no. It's fine. It's fine. I know where you're going with this. First of all, I would say determinists beg the question by simply saying that whatever an indeterminist. Why haven't we thought of that phrase? That's much better than free will proponent. Whatever an indeterminist, argues is the moment of decision. A determinist just says, yeah, but you didn't have any choice but to decide that. That's begging the question. But anyway, back to what you were saying, because I know where you're going. If you didn't have any choice but to hook your decision-making power to a mechanism of indeterminacy, you're still determined. But I reject that as completely logically self-defeating. Because in a paradigm of determinacy, why would determinacy create a mechanism to defeat itself? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so we're going to determine everything that you're going to do or whatever, and not we're, but everything is going to be determined, but we will create a method, and this is a God argument, I suppose. God is going to determine everything, but I will go ahead and create a method where you can go ahead and flip a coin, and I will determine things that way, while you think that it's not. Anyway, yeah.
I understand, Daniel. Your rebuttal is easy. You just say, "I never said it had to make sense," right? It just is.
No, I think it makes sense. I think if you're saying I'm going to do this, I'm going to flip a coin to make my decision for me. Your decision to flip a coin wasn't your decision under determinacy. You were determined to flip a coin.
That was your strongest motive in that moment. Whatever.
And
rather than making the decision based on any other factors, you just decided in that moment.
No.
I'm going to do this based on a coin flip instead.
That's okay. I grant that. Even if your decision to flip a coin or to tie your decision to the atom splitter was determined, it still breaks the chain of determinacy because you have attached it to a mechanism of indeterminacy. So if in fact the position of a proton in a split atom is indeterminable, then it doesn't matter that your decision to tie your decision, let's call it that your I don't know another word for decision, that your decision to tie your decision to an engine of indeterminacy, it doesn't matter that was determined because still the determinacy chain is broken. And all I'm trying to do is get out of that chain. Once you're out of that chain, that means that decisions don't need to be determinable. And if they don't need to be determinable, I don't think that you need the magic feather to do that.
So let me respond before we move on from this example. So I'm gonna go, instead of a coin flip, let's go to the atom splitter thing, because that's a truly quantum event. Sure. Where the photon can go left or right, and even if you know all the factors, you only have a 50-50 odds either way. So it truly, let's just agree that it's truly indeterministic. So you say, I'm going to let this app decide. It's going to contact this lab in Geneva, Switzerland, where they're going to fire this photon, and it's going to go left or right. And then I'm going to agree to follow in advance whatever the app tells me to do. I'm going to do that thing. So I've turned over.
Does that app really do that, by the way? Because that seems like really expensive.
No, it really doesn't. Well, there's probably knockoff ones, but there are real ones that you have to pay like money for. So you do the experiment, it fires the photon, and let's just say in this hypothetical example, it goes left. So before you did that experiment, it could have equally possible that it could have gone right, but it goes left. So the option that you put in for what you would do if it goes left, let's say you said, if it goes left, I'm going to take the bus. And if it went right, I was going to walk to work. So it goes left, so you take the bus. So the question is, did you choose to take the bus? No, because you didn't choose for the photon to go left. It just did. So in an indeterministic system, the photon going left or right is the determining factor, not you.
Sure. I'm not arguing that if you tie your decision to an engine of indeterminacy, then you've chosen the outcome. You haven't, but you have chosen not to be determined. And to me, that implies the existence of decision making outside of a deterministic framework.
But you're assuming that you chose.
You've chosen not to. Yeah, you've chosen to be determined by something else.
Yeah, but I would say under determinism, you were determined to decide to use the atom splitter app to make your decision.
I don't know. You were determined to use the atom splitter to determine your decision. Let's use the terminology correctly. The terminology.
Yeah,
well, it's we've I'm not running away from this fight, but we did go over this exhaustively. There's no end here. I can tell you, there's no end here. So if somebody wants to give a closing argument or a parting shot, that's fine. I didn't mean to take up the last 20 minutes on my own. So go ahead. I'm done. I've said my piece. I know that Daniel and I disagree, but go ahead.
I wanted to pose a question. I don't know. That's not a closing thought, I guess. But the question I had coming into this, what I wanted the free will side or to show is or explain their answer to is what is the X factor? Like is it intelligence, something you're calling intelligence, something you're calling spirit inside of us, something that's removed from the physical world? It seems to me that if you're advocating for free will, you have to argue that there's something that has an ability to override what the laws of physics are determining the outcome to be. So, is that something in the quantum realm? And if so, how can you demonstrate that our intelligence?
I would clarify, it doesn't have to override the law of physics. It just has to play into it and affect them. It has to act on those laws of physics, right?
Yeah, it seems to me like you're just saying, it feels like I have free will, so I must. And if I must, then there must be some explanation. But nobody ever provides evidence in my mind that this free will exists beyond it feels like I do. Or even worse, I just would not want that to be the case, that my actions are determined, so I'm just not going to accept that. And for me, those are bad reasons. Just perceiving that you have free will doesn't seem like a sufficient reason, and not wanting it to be the case seems like an insufficient reason.
Well, I feel that is maybe a straw man of my 20-minute argument. I feel like I have free will, so I do. That's not what I said, Daniel.
No, I'm not saying that you said that there, but I'm not even responding to you in particular, just to all of you. I don't see how any of you have presented an argument that we have free will, evidence that we have free will. I should say.
There is no way to prove this. You're saying, look, if this is a metaphysical spark, then how can you prove it? And we started by saying we can't prove it, and I don't think either proposition is provable. So I think that the question becomes one of usefulness, even though that question itself assumes will. It's circular, as I said. But I think that I can say over the last 2 weeks, my thinking on this topic has developed and has become more, I think, more acute and defensible in my own mind, at least. But also I have moved on where I am on the spectrum of how much of our decisions are determined versus chosen. And I've moved toward more determinism. So I want hats off to you, Mr. Woodfield and Mr. Day. I have moved toward your side. I'm just still on this side of the field or the arena or whatever sports metaphor we want to choose. I still believe that there is at least the potential for influence plus X to make a decision. And that X, we can call it will, we can call it intelligence, we can call it agency, whatever you want to call it. It is, as far as we know, a physically immeasurable property. You're right. It's metaphysical as far as we know.
And the evidence that you gave, Dave, that is the logical argument that you made, that if we have the ability to turn our decisions over to anything else, anyone else, I mean, just to give away the decision, if we can veto our decision, if all of the outside and external influences can come in, and there is some, I mean, that was the best evidence-wise that we have, is this idea that if we can, this thought experiment, this logical thought experiment, that if I can, again, the idea is if there is anything in the universe that is indeterminate, that you cannot know the outcome, then that is sufficient to
For the
say,
possibility of breaking a deterministic chain.
yeah,
That is sufficient for the possibility of breaking a deterministic decision-making tree.
I would agree with that.
Sure.
And so-
And
It allows
that's
space
all we're
for free
saying.
will. Yeah,
That's
it
all we're
allows
saying.
space for free will. Mhm.
But
And
That's all we can really
but
do.
it's not. But it isn't required. It's not necessary. It's sufficient for that, but it isn't necessary to have that random thing out there, because none of us are saying that there is randomness or that we are in control of randomness. What we are suggesting, because randomness isn't what we're arguing about here. We're not arguing that there's something, random and
Indeterminacy.
indeterminate. Yeah, we're arguing that in some way, with all the inputs that go into making our decision, all of the particles and forces in the universe, that there is some power to act on those forces that we have somewhere. And again, yeah, we can't prove it, and we feel it, and we also believe that it is more useful to assume it. And so when
But
you ask
also,
us,
it's I don't want my position to be characterized as we feel it and we think it's more useful. I think that it does go beyond that. I think that the ability to posit the thought experiment is itself something, because, and I'm not going to go back through it all again because that would take another 10 minutes. But I think that to be able to consider, could I do this? The only difference between doing that and actually doing it is a technological advance. So my will, my essence is not dependent on a technological advance. Therefore, because I can think through the thought experiment, I believe that if there is such a thing as indeterminacy in the universe, that I could do that experiment exactly as I've described. And so what's the difference between doing it and thinking through it? Anyway, I can... I begged us to stop talking about this last week when we kept going back and forth, and I'm going to do it again. We need to be done with this conversation. If we're going to do this again next week, I'll sit out because I can't do it anymore. But I
think I can
appreciate
make
everybody's thoughts on this. I've really learned a lot. Go ahead, Joey. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I think I can make something of a closing statement, maybe. What I really want to do is tie this back to epistemology, right? Daniel's question, he wants the proponents of free will to prove it to him somehow. He's asking you to tie it back to something empirical, whether that's quantum mechanics or something, right? Something that's observed or observable in the known universe, right? And I think I don't want to like put words in anybody's mouth or make assumptions about anybody, but y'all's epistemology, y'all's worldview is just not built on that same foundation as Daniel's. And so when Steve says, I can't prove it, what do you mean by prove? You can't prove it to Daniel's satisfaction because it doesn't have the same epistemic foundation. You feel like you have proof that satisfies you based on your own epistemic foundation, which is different from Daniel's, right? And whether that's the LDS Standard Works, personal revelation, and same with me. I hope that you guys can see that my position, I know you think that it's a contradiction, self-contradictory, but I hope you can see that it's at least consistent with my epistemic foundation. I'm being consistent with what I think is the way to know truth. And I've criticized other positions within my same, corner of things, where I see inconsistency and trying to smuggle things in through the back door, right? And I think that's kind of at the root. We're never going to resolve this. We could keep talking about it till we're blue in the face, and we're never going to get to the bottom of. And I do appreciate what you were saying a second ago, Dave, that this feels to you like a very foundational thing. And I don't think you're wrong about that, but I do think there's a deeper foundation that these ideas that we've all come to are stemming from deeper commitments that we have to how do we even know what's real, and we end up in different camps on this question because of commitments that we've made further up the chain or further down the chain, however you want to do the analogy. But Yeah. Does that make
along
sense?
those lines, I really appreciate that, because along those lines too, I mean, I'm thinking one of the, epistemological sources and reasonings just for how we know what we know and who we are is the whole Descartes, statement of I think, therefore I am, right? And that in and of itself gives a little bit of weight, like Dave was saying, to the persuasion of that I have free will simply because I think I can choose, and so therefore I can choose. There's just that that epistemological argument too. Doesn't come from scripture, doesn't come from any evidence outside. It's simply that I feel that, and anyway. I want to hear from Jacob and Corey before we go to what you want to add to this discussion.
This might open a whole nother can of worms. So if we need to push this somewhere else, we can. But I think more interesting than discussing, right? Because we've hit, and it's beating a dead horse at this point, talking about, we can't prove whether determinism or free will is actually the case. So I think from those of us that believe in free will, since we're all living as if we have free will anyway, how much does your free will account for your decision? Dave, you said that you've been pushed far, and then you even put down a number, 99.99. Like, if it's that much determined anyway, what's really the point of free will? When the odds are stacked that much, how much, whatever of that spark, is it going to take for you to actually make a decision that goes outside of that? And how much can you really be held accountable for anything if it's that much stacked against you?
Well, first of all, I want to clarify, I was not attempting to actually quantify anything when I said 99.9 repeating. That was hyperbole to say that the vast majority of, I think, our actions are determined without the significant exercise of will. I think that we mostly do what our subconscious has concluded that we will do based on its weighing of the influences that are all these inputs. Now, my position has always been that the moment of will is not necessarily choosing one of the various outcomes that were given, but rather choosing how much weight to give each of the inputs. That, and either way you look at it, that's still an exercise of will, to assign weights to the input or to choose an ultimate outcome. I don't know how often.
And we're not saying that we're just assuming free will at this point. How much do you actually have influence over those decisions, and how much will is there?
I would add,
it's not a 50-50.
I would add that I'm not even certain from my viewpoint that we have necessarily the ability to wait and choose it from among all the options. Honestly, sometimes the decision may be determined based on weights that are predetermined, whatever. But I would simply say that even for me, I think I just have something internal. This is my understanding of it and how I've thought through it. And I've been this way. I want to say this isn't something I've come to over the course of the last few weeks of our discussion. I was this way like a decade ago. But my feeling is that I simply have an input. There's an internal spark, light, divine portion of me, the intelligence that allows me to, despite or together with all of the external inputs, I get to put in my input, which is simply this one choice, whether I will lean towards the light and truth and good and right and God and knowledge and all things that are from God, or whether I will lean generally away and turn away from God and good and light and truth. And that just adds that one, that's the kind of the only agency for me that is enough for me to say I have some will, some choice. And once I've decided on a kind of I can do this kind of on a daily basis, but it's also part of my general, who I am, whether I'm going to face towards the good and the right and God. And then that added influence makes my decision for me, in many, many cases. Anyway, that's to me, and I do believe, in answer to your question, Jacob, that even if 99.9 repeating is determined and all I get is that one input of which way I'm facing, I think that has eternal significance and implications to everything. And so that's why I do think it's still very, very important.
I think it is as unquantifiable as it is unprovable that we even have this X factor, much less how much of it is going into each decision. But I like Stephen's hypothesis here that it might be that our will is not exercised on a decision by decision basis, but rather on a philosophy basis, and we choose that we're going to add in love for God as an input in all decisions. I mean, we choose to add the input or something. I don't know. I mean, you obviously, we're making stuff up at this point. We've been making stuff up since the beginning, but to explain how it works or where that X factor comes in or how much of a role it plays, I can't answer that question. I like Stephen's idea that maybe at best we can just choose which way to face, in our decision making. Are we done?
Right. Yeah. Corey, did you want to add anything else? Or maybe I'll put in my 2 cents just really quickly instead of just
If you
asking a
got
question and not
2 cents,
answering.
insert them into the sense machine.
I'm in the camp that, and I think most of us are, that right, the majority of what we act on is based on nature and nurture and all of these other things, and not so much just ourselves. But I don't think it's quite so heavily weighted against us. I don't know. Like you said, we can't really quantify it, but to me, it feels something like, I don't know, probably like an 85-15 or something like that. Obviously, in different, I'm just talking about like random everyday things, right? But obviously, every decision is different, right? And of course, it gets in crazy levels. But I just wanted to make a point that I don't think that it's so determined that like it's so outlandish for you to do something out of character, because I think we see people do things, quote unquote, out of character more often than that.
In fact, I gotta say one more thing on this. We've talked about the example of the addict of years and years who decides against every input that he has. In the moment that the needle touches his skin and he's ready to go, it's extremely uncommon for an addict in that position to not inject that substance. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, I don't know if it ever happens in that moment, but it probably has. Okay. So let's posit this person. Let's assume this person exists or has existed. In that moment, now I know Daniel's response here is, well, his desire to be clean overwhelmed his desire for the drug. But my own view is that that's the moment that you're talking about, Jacob. I would say in that moment, to do something so completely against every other influence that was voting in that decision in his mind, that had to be an act of will. Now, certainly he had a desire to be clean, a desire to clean up, a desire to get his life back together, a desire to turn to Jesus, whatever it was. And all of that was powerful, but I cannot imagine that became overpowering to his desire to use that drug in that moment after so many years of choosing the other way without some X factor. So that would be that's my answer to your question, Jacob. It's totally undefensible, And I admit that. And I know that Daniel, you disagree with it, and I know why, and I accept your disagreement. But that's where I would put that X factor.
All right.
Corey?
I got some 2 cents too. If that's okay. So basically, again, yeah, like you can't obviously down to the point to it. I mean, not yet. I mean, maybe in the future. And I did throw a couple articles in there that says at least a re-examination of the neuroscience on how people were pointing to free will not existing. As far as neuroscience goes, there's new science that would say, it's not quite that simple as it's been tried to say. But there are 2 different arguments that we're making here. There's, the metaphysical idea of free will, and then, the scientific proof for that in the physical world. And obviously both can't be all the way proven. One, because we're humans and we're not dead, and so we can't go ask God or cease to exist, whichever one of those is going to happen. And we don't know everything about science and the way our brain works. But as far as the things I've thought about free wills, it seems to be, and I don't, you could posit that this could happen of causation, I guess, but I think it's important to recognize that the thing that makes us humans is the fact that we can deliberate and consider, and we have desires such as animals do. They come upon us, but it seems that rather than just choosing our strongest desires, that we can actually choose what our strongest desire is. We can have, desires to do certain things, but as you said, and this is where the LDS theology comes and really helps. This is what I actually find useful, is that it says, if you are not conscious and you're not trying, you will be determined, you will be acted upon. But it's our choice when we're conscious to choose to act as opposed to be acted upon. And that's what separates us from animals. That's what the LDS theology terms the natural man, is to do the natural thing, to do what you're already inclined to do. And so, at least for me, it helps us actually make sense of life. And again, this is just the pragmatism, if it makes the most sense. But in the end, I don't know which of you have children, but assuming that you do, you praise them or you correct them based on certain behaviors. And that's assuming, you have to assume that they have some sort of power to do otherwise. But at the same time, for example, we don't chide a 2-year-old when he wets his pants. Maybe until let's go a little younger, you can get potty trained, because they don't have control over that. But once we as adults start wetting our pants, we say, well, clearly that's because you have the cognitive ability to choose otherwise. And without that, for me personally, and again, I'm not saying you can't live a good life if I think atheists often may lead more moral lives in the end because they think about it a little bit more than maybe some of the general people. And this isn't, I'm not talking about you, Joy, but the general idea of just like, well, everything's up to God, and if God wanted me to help the orphan, then he probably would either make me do it or he would have done it by himself. So I just have to let it happen how it's going to happen. But at the same time, if you try to live your life with the deterministic worldview, you'll find, and that's why we all struggle, and I've noticed, what would that look like? It wouldn't look like anything, because humans can't do it. It's not possible. And that doesn't mean it's not true, but it just means it's not possible. And in the end of the day, again, it's pragmatism, but if it's not going to help anybody do anything, then if you believe in God, then you must say, obviously, there's a reason God helped me feel this way. And if not, then it's the Pascalian, I have nothing to lose by just acting like I have free will, and I have everything to lose just be like, I don't know, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. But you just can't turn it off. It's who we are. And so that's where I think that's why we posit a causal agent in there. And again, you can't prove it because it's unprovable, but it's all the evidence does, not of it, but all the apparent evidence points to that being the case.
I did really appreciate Joey's kind of summarization of where we're all kind of coming from based on our epistemology. And I appreciated definitely hearing Jacob and Corey's thoughts here. Corey, with regard to what you just said about us being human, and I think we all recognize that with our consciousness, we live lives making these choices and at least feeling like we have a choice. And I would add there that, it doesn't seem as if most other animals have the kind of choice that we have. One thing that hasn't been mentioned here is simply that I feel like if it was all just simply a evolutionary process without being guided, it seems like it would be inefficient for us to evolve a sense of making choices when we don't actually have one. This idea that I'm going to evolve a moment of pause to consider all of my options, to then go forward and do the thing that I would have done anyway. That just seems dangerous, because in the moment, many decisions, that would slow us down. But that's just an extra side note and a reason that I personally have for feeling like, we have this choice because we have the choice, not because we evolved it. But Dave, you want to say something else and wrap us up? Or no? Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I appreciate you all joining us for this discussion. Yes, let's honor Dave's wish and be done with talking about free will and determinism. We have spent weeks on it. It's been fun, and I don't think anybody's changing their opinions overall. But as Dave said, some of us have leaned a little more towards the opposite side, and hopefully we're listening to each other. So thank you so much for joining me.